Well, good morning, everyone. I know yesterday was a long 12-hour day and a bit of a sprint, but I hope everyone's recharged their batteries. I just wanted to offer a couple of personal thoughts about yesterday that I think are important. I think, the dialogue that we had that was very robust really highlighted the importance of multidisciplinary interaction in this area. And just a couple of comments that I thought were really telling was when Robert Graves, we got into a discussion about how many fault ruptures do we need to incorporate to characterize the risk to structures, really a critical question for performance-based engineering. And Robert slipped in a comment that I thought was absolutely astute. He said, well, the engineering community has to tell us what parameters and what response quantities are most important in terms of dictating the response of their structure. And then the earth science community can turn that back into an understanding of what parameters in the rupture model and in the physics, embedded physics, need to be really focused on and varied. And I think that's really true, and it's something we've learned in our work, that deep dialogue between the structural engineering community and the end users, in essence, and the people generating the ground motions is absolutely crucial. So I hope that's something that we can identify from this forum and carry forward in this area, because you can't be stovepiped doing these end-to-end simulations. It just doesn't work. Number two, I thought Jonathan Bray's talk was really a good reminder about the challenges of incorporating geotechnical layers and the influence of geotechnical layers in these models. And we have to be mindful of that. You can't forget that. It's terribly complicating from a simulation standpoint. Number one, you've got these small soft layers that really drive a low wave speed, and computationally that makes it very, very challenging, even in a linear sense, to capture some of these very low velocity sediments. And historically, you see us cutting off the V sub S 30, for example, and using 500 meters per second or 250 meters per second. And that's probably not going to do it when we get into these regional scale simulations somewhere like the Bay Area, where you have a lot of lenses of very soft sediments. We're missing a lot. And then not to mention the discussion about what do we do if those local areas behave non-linearly. That raises the computational challenge even more. So I guess I thought that the way we had characterized yesterday with a broad swath of multidisciplinary presentations really brought some of that really important dialogue to light. So I wanted to mention that. Day two is quite different, as Holiday just mentioned. Day one was focused on the constituent capabilities and technologies that are needed to bring these types of simulations to fruition. Day two is changing gears, and in the first part of the day, it's going to be dedicated to building confidence, what we've characterized as building confidence in regional scale simulation tools. And in the committee's mind, this certainly includes traditional verification and validation, making sure your software is computing what you intended it to compute in a verification sense. And then secondly, the higher burden of validating that what you're computing is representing the physics correctly, the traditional validation. Those are really, really key and important, obviously. And we'll hear about that today in some of these sessions and how we do that in these regional scale simulations. But there's more to building confidence. And we think there needs to be metrics and acceptance criteria for synthetic motions. How can we either reject or accept synthetic motions that have been generated, or how can we perhaps in some sense grade them so that the pedigree of those motions is clear, and we don't have a whole slew of synthetic motions out there floating around that are just are wrong or incorrect. And so it seems that developing metrics and acceptance criteria is critically important, and we're going to hear about that today. Then, of course, a dialogue that was the sort of long and continuous thread throughout our discussions yesterday is how do we characterize and propagate uncertainties in these models? And that particularly came into play in discussions about the mechanics of the fault rupture, as well as the geologic subsurface characterization that is really limiting in terms of our deterministic simulations at high frequencies. How do we deal with that? And we're not going to have overnight super detailed 3D models. Do things like incorporating stochastic geology really make sense in terms of getting us to a place where we can begin to generate motions that are usable in a performance-based earthquake engineering sense. Then we've added two sessions, and we'll see how this goes, but one we wanted to add because we wanted to discuss the transition to practice for performance-based earthquake engineering. How do we get the things that we're doing in this domain out of the hands of the researchers and into the hands of the practitioners? Because at the end of the day, engineers have to evaluate and they have to build things. So what is the right phased approach to doing that? And it seems like at this instant in time, as these capabilities and methodologies advance, it's really important to ask that question because that can guide the applied research in a way that most effectively gets us to practice in the most effective way and timely way. So that's going to be an important dialogue. And then finally, operational modes for broadening community access, a panel discussion, again, focused on how can we take the capabilities and the ground motions that have been developed and get those into the hands of the broader community. The general broad community is not going to be using, the world's fastest computer on a daily basis to generate synthetic ground motions. Can we envision an operational model whereby those motions are generated in some community consensus mode and then distributed effectively to the R&D community? And we have some ideas about that we'll touch on this afternoon. And in fact, we're going to have a pilot project with Peer to test the waters for translating those types of motions to the community. So the characteristics of today are quite different, but I think the topics are just as important and just as timely as the technology-focused topics of yesterday. So we're really looking forward to